We left off by articulating the concept that ein locha davar shenasas mitzvasai umay alam boy. In other words, the Mishnah writes that the people that used the liquids, the waters that were filled with the bloods of kachim to fertilize their orchards, their fields, needed to pay hegdish for it, and if not, they would be violating me'ilah. And the Gemara brought down that even though indeed there is a machlokes tanoim whether there is me'ilah or not, but that's only on a rabbinic level. We're speaking about whether you can be moil in the dam of kachim. On a biblical level, lokula alma, there is no me'ilah on the bloods that come from kachim, and we had no less than 3 sources for that halach. So we had Ula that says, quoting the pasuk, actually from Achrei Mois, and we are applying it to all dam of kachim. When the Torah uses the words lochem, va'ani nesativ lochem ala mezbeach lachapet, in reference to the dam. Lochem means it belongs to you. Biblically, there is no me'ilah. Then we had the yeshiva from Rabbi Shimon that learned it from the words lachaper, that lachapara nesativ v'loy me'ilah. And Rabbi Yochanan, the final shita, uses the word who in that same pasuk, ki hadam, who banefesh yechaper, who means it is. It is means it's in a consistent state of being. Now, consistent means what? Now, this can go both ways. Either l'chumra, that just like before the dam is used, there's me'ilah. Even after it's used, it's me'ilah. But we don't say it in that direction. We say that just like for sure, after the damim were used, there's no me'ilah on the damim, not biblically. Who means that lifnei kapara is like la'achar kapara. The Gemara asked, well, why don't you say it in the opposite direction? Why don't you say that just like prior to kapara, it's dam kacha? There's me'ilah. Even after it's used, there is also going to be a din of me'ilah. So that was the statement. No, that can't be, because ein l'chadavar, that even after the mitzvah was done, it should be subject to me'ilah. There is no such a thing. That's where we left off. Problem is that there are exceptions. Trumas hadeshin, even after the ashes were removed off the mizbeach, that means the final mitzvah was done, there is still a din of me'ilah. Every step is important. How do you know there's a din of me'ilah? So Rashi reminded us, since the Torah says, V'samoi, you have to place these ashes, eitzel ha-mizbeach, v'samoi meaning that you atone geniza. Geniza means that you may not even derive benefit from those ashes. So there's a rule, a premise. Rashi says that if something that belongs to God is asur bahana, automatically it means that there is a chiyuv me'ilah. So the Gemara responded, true, Trumas Hadeshin is a exception, and there is another exception, and those are the garments of the Kohen Gadol after him using it on a Yom Kippur, when the Torah adds the words Vihi Nicham Sham. True, it's subject to a machlokes tanoim, what these words mean, but we're based on those who opine Vihi Nicham Sham means it may never be used by anyone again. And again, to unim geniza, asur bahana. Asur bahana means it's subject to me'ilah. The mitzvah was done with these begadim, it may never be used again. Another exception that here, even though nasas mitzvasai, yes, subject to me'ilah, but since there are only 2 exceptions, so we have now the klal that shnei ksuv maboim kiyechad ein malamdem. That's where we're up to. So the damim after kapara for sure won't be subject to me'ilah. So the who must be going in the direction that lifnei kapara is la'acher kapara. Now we're going to be learning a little bit more about the dinim of dam of a carbon. For example, we're going to chazer rules that we learned in Zvachim, that if someone who shechted a carbon, kachim, had a machshavas pigul, indeed invalidating the animal, and anyone who, God forbid, will eat an animal that became pigul is going to be chayiv kares. The dam of that animal, now obviously we may never consume dam, chayiv kares, but if someone consumed that dam, true, they violated dam, but they did not violate consuming pigul, because dam of kachim can never become pigul, as we'll review the limud, how we know that, and other interesting dinim when it comes to the damim of kachim. And on Daf Samach, we're going to start the new Mishnah. We already quoted this Mishnah above, the machloikis, the very important machloikis, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nechemia, regarding the following: that since the Torah uses the words chukah when it comes to sharing with us the sequence of the avodah of Yom Kippur, and chukah means it's essential, out of sequence, even if the Kohen Gadol ended up doing all the steps, but if he did it out of sequence, it is invalid to the point that it has to be redone. No one debates the concept that out of sequence, invalid. The question is, what parts of the avodah are invalidated if they were done out of sequence? And the two options are only the avodas that are done lifnim. We're going to learn our sugya, the way Rashi teaches lifnim, inside the Holy of Holies. And there's going to be certain steps, even though that they are technically done outside, but since they are being done for pnim, they will be classified as the avodah of pnim, as we'll see. According to everyone, the avodah that's done pnim, if it's done out of sequence, is invalid. Uchalash Chazal, lo yasav lo klum. You did nothing. It was completely ineffective. However, the other one is even more machmer. He says any avodah that's done with the Kohen Gadol's big day lavan, not the morning daily avodah, which is also done on Yom Kippur, not the afternoon, timidim kisidron, but anything that's shayach dafka to Yom Kippur, even if it's not done in the Holy of Holies, there also, if it was done out of sequence, then lo yasa v'lo klum. And we're going to have the Rab Chanina that we already learned also above, that if the Ketores, Shechafana, Koidem, Shchitasai, that if the Kohen Gadol did the Chafina of the Ketores prior to shechting the bull, also out of sequence, that Chafina is invalid. You have to shecht the bull, and then you have to do the Chafina again, Chavre, and much, much more. We are mamish geschmack, journeying through Hoitzi Eloi. Right, today's daf Samach, just to know that Samach Aleph and Samach Beis already is where we're going to enter the 6th chapter. It's amazing. We're in 5th chapter, the 6th chapter. The only Pedic that deals with Yom Kippur in Golus, which is also going to continue the dinim of Inoi, will be in the 8th final chapter. Mamish, the whole Yoma is a Masechta of Kachim, of David and the Beis HaMikdash. Okay, so we left off on daf Samach Amid Aleph. We left off 3 lines on top of the Amid. And as we just spoke out, that the Gemara said, we stand our ground with the cloud that ein l'chadav shenasas mitzvasai and still moyalam boy. There is no such a thing. There is such a thing. That's exceptions. Why don't you use the exception as a prototype? Because God gave 2 exceptions. And if God would have wanted for us to learn from one of those 2, that there are times where even after something was fully done, the mitzvah was finalized, it's still subject to me'ilah. Why would Hashem have to write it twice? Fakert, the fact that God has to write something twice is in itself a proof that neither one of these 2 can be used as a source law. None of them can be used as a prototype. They are exceptions to the exclusion of all other cases. Now the second case was Big Day Kahuna. Guys, we learned about this already before. Is it true that the begadim of the Kohen Gadol may never be used, period? That's really a machlokes tanoim. Now, the Torah writes the words, place the garments there, completely superfluous, which certainly limits its further usage. The question is, does the pshat v'hini chamsham mean no one is ever allowed to use it? That means shenasas mitzvasai, and there is a chiyuv me'ilah. However, the problem is, according to the Tana Rebbe Doisi that says that big day kahuna ru'uyin hein l'koyin hegdit, true, the Kohen Gadol can never use it again on Yom Kippur, but it's still usable. You can't classify these garments as garments shenasas mitzvasai. It can still be used by your Kohen Hedyot. So that's not shnei ksuvim. So now we're back that there is one exception, l'chayre trumas hadeshen, nasas mitzvasai, v'samai, meaning tu'unim geniza, meaning asur bahana, meaning subject to me'ilah. Maybe that should be a source for other scenarios where even though the mitzvah was done, like the dam, you sprinkled it on the mizbeach, you already poured the shenayim, so what? Maybe it's still subject to me'ilah. And then Rabbi Yechon should say that lifnei kapara, that the la'achar kapara can lifnei kapara, maybe. And fakir dam should be subject to me'ilah biblically. So the Gemara answers, mishum dahava trumas hadeshen ve'egla arufa. Now, Egla Rufa, if someone is found, God forbid, murdered outside a city, in the case where we do not know who is the murderer, so at that time, before discovering the individual that's guilty, there is a collective communal guilt, and for which the community has to seek atonement for. And some of the details is, the Torah says that they have to take a calf and they have to decapitate the calf. Banochal, machlokes rishonim, what that means, but be that as it may, the Torah uses the words va'arfu, sham es ha'egla banochal. Sham is extra. Sham means you have to leave it there, even after this calf is decapitated, leave it there again, leave it there, meaning that it's asur b'hana'ah, even after you decapitated it. Why do you have to? So why do we see from over there the exception that even after the mitzvah was done, it's asur b'hana? So yes, you have again shnei ksuvim haboim kiechad, and again v'chol shnei ksuvim haboim kiechad ein melamdim. So for sure, dam la'acher kapara is not going to be subject to me'ilah biblically. And again, since you have the words who, and you compare prior post or post prior, it has to be in the direction post. For sure, there's no me'ilah. Must be who, even lifnei kapara, you shech the animal, the bloods of kachim are not subject to me'ilah midoiraisam. Frek the Gemara, hanicha lamando amarei melamdim. That in itself is a machlokes throughout Shas. Do we say that if God repeated something twice, that means that these two may never be used as a source law? Nothing can be derived from it, as we explained the logic, because if one would have been, or either one could be used as a prototype, Hashem would not need to write it in the second one. But Elo Lamanda Amar, that if you only have two, still Milamdim, now everyone agrees that if Hashem writes an exception 3 times, then the 3 may never be used as a source. But by 2, still Malamdim, Ma'ika Lameimar, again, maybe the Dam. Let's begin with La'acher Kapara. La'acher Kapara, maybe it's subject to Me'ilah. And if that would be the case, then say who? Just like Lifnei Kapara, it's subject to Me'ilah. Why would it not be? La'acher Kapara also. So the Gemara says, here it's different. Here, everyone will agree that these 2 sources cannot be used as a prototype to teach in any other place. Why? Because by the din of Trumas Hadeshen, had the Torah only wanted to say that the ashes should be placed, the Torah did not need to use the letter Vav. It could have said, V'sam Eitzel HaMizbeach, place it, meaning Ton Geniza, meaning Asur Bahana, meaning subject to Me'ilah. V'sam Moi, place it. It's not about the ashes, but this din, that even though you did the mitzvah, nevertheless, it's still subject to me'ilah. It's only by it. It's an exclusionary expression. Similarly, by the egla rufa, aside of the extra word sham, right, from where we learned that it's ton geniza, that it's asur bahana'a, but the Torah writes the words ha arufa, va'arfu sham es ha egla, es ha egla ha arufa. The Torah could have written the words arufa. The hey hayediyah means only here do we apply this dim of sham, meaning even though the mitzvah was finalized, it's still asur bahana, and to the exclusion of all other cases. So now that we established that it cannot be that dam, after it's used, after it's poured as shirayim, after the mitzvah was completed, it for sure cannot be subject to me'ilah. So Rabbi Yechanan, who learns from the word who, it is in a constant state. Well, if la'acher kapara, for sure it's not subject to me'ilah, then we have to learn lifnei kapara from la'acher kapara. Ma la'acher kapara ein by me'ilah, af lifnei kapara ein by me'ilah. Now let's step back. All of this is just to clarify Rabbi Yechanan. We had 3 limudim. Ula, the Vei Rab Shimon, Rabbi Yechanan. Why do we need to have 3 limudim? So says the Gemara, V'hani tolasi kroi badam lomali. Now, each one, for some reason, is learning this specific din from their extra word, but they all have to learn something else from the other one's extra word. Okay. And the Gemara is not going very much back and forth on why one doesn't say the other, but at least a general overview. We have the lochem, and we have the lachaper, and we have the who, zok the Gemara zoi. 1, indeed, there are 3 limudim. lema'uta min noisar, which means that if blood was left over, like if, God forbid, some of the meat of the kachim were left over beyond the prescribed time when they may be consumed. First of all, one should not have allowed them to be left over. And if they were left over, the rule is that if one consumes that part of the korban, the chayiv kares. What happens if dam was left over, noisar, and someone consumed it? Now, b'chlal, for dam consumption, you're going to be chayiv kares. True. We want to know whether you will also be chayiv for noisar. So that is this limud that dam is excluded from the isur of noisar. Of course, you can't eat it because it's dam, but the noisar aspect does not apply to dam. V'chad lema'utei mimeila, which is mamish what we're learning right now. Whichever one, each one l'shitasai, which word, that if dam, guys, not only after dam was poured ashirayim, from when you shecht an animal, the dam is in a mizrak. If someone derived benefit which they shouldn't have, they're not subject to me'ilah. Like Rashi says, they have to pay the keren to the Beis HaMikdash. That has a value, but they don't have to pay the choimish. They don't bring the karban hasham me'ilos. And the third, lema'utei mituma, same concept. Remember, guys, if the kohen is tamei and he consumes kachim, God forbid, chiyuv kares. If the kohen is tamei, if a kohen who's tamei consumes dam, now he's going to be chayiv for dam consumption. But the din that, it's kachim and you're tamei and you consumed it, for that, dam is not included in that isur. It's excluded from that isur. It's yours. Or it's only for kapara. But it's not gonna allow you, so to say, to violate the isur karas of consuming betuma. So now the Gemara has, just to conclude the sugya, if we need an extra limud excluding dam from the regular dinei kachim, isn't there another din by kachim, the din of pigul? And de facto, if a korban became pigul and someone consumed that korban's dam, like the chayiv for the dam, but they're not going to be chayiv from pigul. They won't be chayiv from pigul. But why would you not need to have noch a fourth limud? Why don't we need another limud just for pigul? So the Gemara says, "Aval mi pigul loy tzarich lema'utei kra." Why the tran chevra chazor of zvachim kol sheyesh loy matirin? We are going to classify the korban as parts of the korban, that they are the permitters, which is zrikas adam, versus parts of the korban that need a permitter. Let me explain what I mean. From when can a person put let's say, the emurim on the mizbeach? Only after zrikas adam. We're not speaking about from when can you technically put it on the mizbeach. Well, technically, you need to separate the emurim from the rest of the animal. I know that. I'm speaking about halachically. There are certain steps in every korban that before you did step B, you cannot do step C halachically. From when can an owner eat the meat of any korban? From when could the kohanim eat the meat from the kohanim? For example, the haktoras emurim is the matir for the kohanim or the owners to eat the meat. We cannot eat our part before the mizbeach ate its part. So when a person puts the emurim on the mizbeach, aside of that being a avoida in itself, it's also going to be classified as a permitter. That only because you did this step are you now permitted to do the next step. You know which part of the korban has no prior permitter? Dam. Of course, you have to shech the korban to get the dam. What we're speaking about halachically. There is nothing halachically that has to be done prior. There's no avoida that you have to do, which only after you did that avoida, now are you permitted to throw it. We don't look at it that way. The first step of the actual avoida, la kapara, is the dam. So in the sugya, I will learn this in more detail in Zvachim, but that's a gavaldik rule. What is subject to the laws of pigul? Something sheyesh loy matirin. Now I don't care if the matirin is an avoidas. What's the lashon over here? Bein la adam, bein la mizbeach. I don't care if the matirin is something that has to be done by an adam versus something that needs to be done on the mizbeach. But as long
what about the Kabbalah and Halacha?
That's not considered a essential for the dam to affect for the dam to affect kapara, it's considered a technical step. You need
because if you shechted it right next to the mizbeach,
I'll give you an example. Then you don't need to have hoylacha. Now you have to have kabbalah, but the kabbalah is not being matir the dam. The kabbalah is just getting the dam for you. We're not looking at it as a step of the avodah proper. Okay. With that, we conclude. So just to clarify, when the Mishnah says that there is me'ilah in the dam, if you don't pay money to the Beis Hamikdash, first of all, it's not l'kula alma, it's a machlekes tanoim. And if the gananin would not pay money to the gizbarim, they would be violating me'ilah midrabanan, but not midorais. Okay.
And can we just assume that the other opinions just have to figure out which word they use for which limud?
That's correct. That's something the Gemara doesn't do. We have to figure out which word from which one and why doesn't one hold to the other. That's something the Gemara doesn't do over here. Okay, Chavre, today's sugya now is one nekuda. Out of sequence, invalidates the avodah. And the machlekas will be which avodas are invalidated out of sequence. Says the Mishnah. Kol Maaseh Yom Kippur ha'amar ala seder. All of these steps that are done on Yom Kippur as following the seder of the Chumash. Now, parenthetically, if you remember, we learned that there are two psukim in the Torah, only two psukim that are out of the seder. If you remember that the removal of the machta and the kaf, we didn't even get there yet, is recorded in the Torah out of the seder. Aside of that, everything else is ala seder. And I think it's kedai for ourselves just to chazer the 10 steps that we're focusing on. So the first step was the vidui on the par. Step number 2 was after the vidui on the par, there was the goydel on the shnei seirim. Step number 3 is that the Kohen Gadol goes back to the same par and he does what we call the vidui sheni and the shchita. Step number 4 is that now is where the Kohen Gadol took the machta and the kaf and he went into the kodesh kachim to offer the ketoros. Step number 5 is the Kohen Gadol now got the dam of the par. Guys, the sword wasn't even slaughtered yet. And he took it into the kodesh kachim and he sprinkled it towards the kapoiris. Step number 6 is what we would call the shchita of the so'ir lashem. Step number 7 is that bringing the dam of the so'ir inside the kodesh kachim. Step number 8 is now taking the dam of the par and doing its avoida outside of the pnim, outside of the holy of holies, doing it in the heichel towards or on the paroiches. Step number 9 is sprinkling the dam of the so'ir on or towards the paroiches. And we are calling step number 10, according to our Tana, right, Rabbi Yoshia, that the damim were mixed and they were sprinkled 4 and 7 on each of the koronos, 7 times al taharoi, and pouring out the shirayim on the yisoid maravi. We had yesterday machlekes tanoim, maybe according to the original, right? I think it was Rabbi Shmuel originally. Everything is done on the yisoid deroimi, but it's poured al the yisoid of the mizbeach hachitzon. These are the 10 steps that we are focusing on, says the Mishnah, that if anything it has to be done on Seder, meaning that if you went out of order, out of sequence, loy asa klum, you did nothing. The procedure is invalid and it must be redone. And the Mishnah gives an example. What's an example? Higdem damasor, the damapar. Now, as of yet, it's not clear, is the Mishnah speaking about inside the Holy of Holies, or is the Mishnah speaking about inside the Holy? And according to Rashi, the words that we are using is the pnim. Here means kodesh kachim, lefnai vilifnim. That's what the Mishnah means here, bifnim, according to Rashi. And if it's not lefnai vilifnim, it's called chutz, even though it's inside the heichel. Now, which one of these steps will clarify that in the Gemara? But Chevra, remember that in both places, the dam hapar always comes before the dam hasoir. So if you went out of sequence, yachzer v'yazem dam hasoir la'achar dam hapar. So if you put the dam hasoir, don't say, well, I skipped the dam hapar. I'm now going to make the par's dam's application. Do that. But you can't say, well, the soir was already done. No, the dam hasoir has to be done dafka after. What was done prior out of sequence is lo yasav v'lo klum. You got to do it again. Another detail Again, here's where Rashi says, unlike the other Rishonim, bifnim in our sugi means kodesh kachim. If before you finish giving the matanos inside the Holy of Holies, nishbach hadam. So yavi dam acher v'yachzer batchila mi bifnim. What needs to be done is that you have to bring new blood, which would mean you have to shech the animal. This Tana holds that, let's say, just for an example, I was in middle of sprinkling the 8 hazois towards the ark cover from the damapor. I was up there, I did the achas lamayla, I'm up, I did the achas v'achas, achas v'shtayim, achas v'sholosh, the dam spilled out, the mizrak fell. This Tana holds that when you go back, you have to shecht another pot. And we're going to speak about more details. If everything has to be done in sequence, that whatever needed to be done, dafka after the pot has to be redone. We'll get to that more in the Gemara. But when you bring the dam of a pot back inside the Holy of Holies, you can't begin achaz va'arba. You have to begin with that set. Now we are dividing the sets of damim into 3. The damims that are brought inside the Holy of Holies, lofnai ve'lofnim. The damim that are brought against or towards the paroiches, and then the damims that are brought and are applied on the mizbeach hapnim, the 4 and the 7. The 4 and each one is a set bifnei atzmai. So if the dam poured out during each one of the sets, during either one of these sets, you have to go back to the beginning of that set. And v'chein behechal. That's where Rashi understands that bifnim means kodesh kachim. Hechal means, so the step of the hechal is you're sprinkling the damim towards the paroiches, and the damim spilled out. So when you have to now go and get new damim, you can't just continue from where you left off. You have to go back to the beginning of the set. And the third set is mizbeach hazav. In other words, if something happened in the hechal, right, I don't have to go back, even according to this Tana, to the kodesh kachim. I don't have to go back to that step. But we separate the pnim, the hechal, and the mizbeach hazav. And if the bloods spilled out during either one of these 3, you have to bring new bloods and begin that set from number 1. Shekulam kapara bifnei atzman, they are considered separate procedures. And this is a two-way, a double-edged statement. A separate procedure means you don't have to repeat the step before it, but in this step, you have to go back to the beginning. However, Rabbi Lazar and Rabbi Shimon Oimrim, and that's the shita that we quoted just now on Daf Nun Ches, on top of the Amid, that if the blood spill and you have to get new damim, we'll go through more pratim in the Gemara about you have to shecht again, what has to be done, if anything, the steps between the shechita and where you were at, is that now out of sequence? Could be. We'll clarify that in a moment. But these 2 Tanoim hold that if the damim spill out and you have to get new damim, you can continue exactly from where you left off. It's not called out of sequence. You ran out of blood by the achas va'arba. So continue now on the achas va'arba. Mimakim shepasak mishamu maschum. Okay, so 2 dinim. Din number 1 in our Mishnah is out of sequence, is invalid. And second, the code of the Mishnah is, if you were interrupted because the dam spilled out, do you have to go back to the beginning of that step, or do you simply continue from where you left off? Says the Gemara. Tana Rabbana.
Is this similar to the fight we had between several guys?
One more.
A new kind of a concept. He has to check the animal.
Yeah. We're going to put everything together now. Today it's very easy. Exactly. So Tana Rabbanon, Benegay, the first din of the Mishnah did not quote a machlokes Tanoim, but the Gemara will. Says in a Braisa, beginning with the same words of the Mishnah. Kol Maisa Yom Kippur, Ha'amar ala Seder. All of the actions of Yom Kippur that are spoken out in Achnei Mois, and they are all ala Seder, parenthetically with the one exception. So the rule is, Im Higdim Maisa L'Chaveiroi Loi Asa Klum. Atkan, what we said in the Mishnah. Now the Braisa elaborates. And the elaboration is really subject to the machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nechemia. Omar Rabbi Yehuda is an explanation of the opening statement of the Braisa. Rabbi Yehuda will call him the Tanach, and he clarifies that Mosai, indeed, when do we say that out of sequence completely invalidates whatever you did, and it will have to be done redone in sequence. That's only bidvarim hanasim bebigdei lovin mi bifnim. Again, Rashi understands mi bifnim. You see Rashi in the Gemara, lifnai velifnim. Only avodas that are done in the Holy of Holies. Now, will there be exceptions? We'll see in a moment. Avol dvarim hanasim bebigdei lovin mi bachutz. The other steps of the avodah, even those that may not be done with the golden garments. The Kohen Gadol is wearing the bigdei lovin. But if they are done mi bachutz, let's look inside the Rashi, second to last narrow Rashi in the Amid. Mi bachutz kigoin, the hagrala, it's important. The girdle of the seirim, the vidui, both the first or the second, shvicha shirayim, v'chol matonos haparoiches, and mizbeach hazav. I'm reading inside the Rashi, the first white line. Im higdim lahem davar mu'uchar. Even though you should not have gone out of sequence, but if you went out of sequence, ein elo ma'akvin olav lepoisloi. Now, where is shchita done? Always outside. Where is the chafina done? Outside. So says Rashi, we'll see this in the Gemara today, we'll get there. I avol b'shchita o b'chafina, even according to Rabbi Yehuda, that limits the out of order invalid, that moide who since the shchita for the par, even though the damim of the pod is not only brought lefnim, it's also brought on the hechel. It's also offered on the mizbeach. But first, it's offered inside the Holy of Holies, shchita, and the chafina, the ketaitis is being offered in the kodesh kachim, who the tzoyrich pnim, it's being done for pnim, ke pnim dami. And therefore, it will become invalidated if it's out of sequence, as we'll speak out more in a moment, which is exactly what you're asking. If something spilled, if you have to do shchita again, right, pasha to get begashmiyas avrama more dam, then even according to Rabbi Yehuda, automatically chafina will have to be done again if you didn't yet offer the ketaitis, to make that clear. Once the ketaitis was already offered, we'll speak more details there. There's a point where you already did that step in sequence. So even though you have to go back to get new dam, but there's no need to do chafina because you won't be bringing ketaitis again. We'll put it all together more on Amud base. But let's first begin with the Yesod. So Rabbi Yehuda limits the rule of the Mishnah only for avodas hanasas bifnim, and Rashi adds the two exceptions because they're not really exceptions because they are considered pnim. Back inside the Gemara, back inside the Brais. Avol duvarim hanasas b'bigdei lavon. We just read those words, even though you should follow the sequence. But if you went out of sequence, masha asa asui, it need not be repeated. It is after the fact, but the Eved valid. However, the Tanach Rebbe Nechemya Oimer, Bamed Dvarim Amurim, going back to Bamed Dvarim Amurim to the opening line in the Braisa, which is the opening line in the Mishnah. That what? That order is critical. He also limits it, but he has a much broader application. Anything that the Kohen Gadol has to wear the bigdei lavin, whether it's bifnim, whether it is behechol, whether he's pouring the dam on the yisoid of the mizbeach hachitz and he's outside the sanctuary, he's wearing the bigdei lavin. Those steps are taka essential, even b'diavad. Ben bifnim, ben b'chutz. Avo b'dvarim anasam b'bigdei zahav mi b'chutz. But any other step of Yom Kippur, the very fact that he's wearing the big days of means that these are steps that Bachlal are done every Shabbos, every Yom Tov, every day. There, Masha Asui Asui Nikoda. No, it's the importance, the essentiality of Seder is connected to Yom Kippur. The question is, how much of Yom Kippur? Anything but big day lavan or only Hanasas Bifnim? Says the Gemara Omer Rabbi Yechanan. I want you to know that Vishnei Mikroi Chadarshu. Side Rabbi Yehuda, side Rabbi Nechemya, they expounded the same, and that's Achrei Mois, Vayikra Tezayin. We're focusing now on Pasuk Lamed Dalid, and the Torah writes, V'hoisa zois lochem lechukas oilam achas bashana. Now guys, chukas is one of the code words of its ma'akev. Remember, Shana b'hakasav la'akev, that's by Kachim. Whenever the Torah writes chuka means that it has to be the way it is. And now we are focusing on the Seder, the order. That order is critical. So Daf Samach Bey. So Rabbi Yehuda Savar, that since the Torah says the words achas, so only makom shemischaprim by pam achas bashana, which is focusing not on the day, but on the location, and not all of the locations were unique to Achas Bashana. Only the locations in which the Avodah was done, Achas Bashana, which is Taka the Avodah, here, Lifnim, normally we call this Lifnai Lifnim. Only there do we apply the word Chukah to tell you that's essential. Right, Top Rashi. Amakoim shekaparasei achas bashana. Only for there does it say chukah. Aval, I'm reading inside Rashi hahechol v'azoros. Now you do avoid every day in the hechol, even though you're wearing big day lavan. In other words, normally when you go into when the Kohen Gadol goes into the hechol, he's not wearing big day lavan. So there is something unique about doing the avoida towards the dama or towards the pareiches. Doesn't matter if the location is not unique. For that, the Torah didn't write chukah. So understands that Rabbi Yehuda back in the Gemara second line. However, Rabbi Nechemia Savar no dvarim hamischaprim behem pam achas bashana. All procedures that are unique. What makes it unique? The fact that the Kohen Gadol wears big day lavan is unique. With all of the pratim, b'chlal the gartel of the Kohen Gadol lekula alma had shatnus in it. But when he wore the big day lavan on Yom Kippur, it didn't. Notice if it's unique, not because of location. Simply because of the bigadim, it's also the achas bashana for which God writes chukah, meaning that seder is of essentiality. Frekti Gemara atul l'Rabbi Yehuda makim ksiv. Doesn't say makim. How does he know to limit the chukah that much? So Ella hainu tamed Rabbi Yehuda, same pasuk lamed daled, because the pasuk says zois, right? V'hoisa zois lochem. Now, the word zois, this is a exclusionary word, meaning that the chukah, which says it's ma'ake, is only for this. So the zois is already hinting to you that we're limiting the application of the chukah. Not only that, achas l'kula alma is also limiting the application of chukah. So we have a double limitation. So chad le'me'utay b'big day lavan mibachutz. In other words, the achas, he'll agree. The kasha was, how do you know that achas is connected to makim? The Gemara says, you're right. If God only would have written achas, then Rabbi Yehuda would have said exactly what Rabbi Nechemia said. Achas is only excluding that something that's done with big day zahav is not included in this. If you went out of sequence, you're out. No, the sequence is essential only for achas bashana. But on top of the achas, the Torah says zois. So the zois is aside of the achas. I'm going to further limit the chukah. What am I going to limit the chukah to? Only the big day. Only big day lavan mibafnim. If it's not big day lavan mibafnim, even if you're wearing the big day lavan, but you're wearing it in bachutz, then we are limiting the din of chukah. We are limiting the din that say that is of essentiality. Gavaldig. Rab Nechemia is also moida that you have two expressions that are of exclusive nature, achas and zois, and chad lema'ute big day zahav. Clearly, in other words, any avodah that's done even on Yom Kippur, but if the Kohen Gadol is wearing the big day zahav, then to say that won't be essential is not essential. The chad lema'ute shirayim. Forget about sequence. You need, according to Rab Nechemia, a pasuk to tell you that if the shirayim were not done, it's not essential. There's something that separates the pouring of the shirayim on the mizbeach hachitzon from all the other steps of the avodah. Shirayim is not essential. Nothing to do with say that shirayim here is the last one. Huh? It cannot be done out of the Seder. It can be done. You can pour some of it on the Mizbeach, but it's not counted. But we don't need it. We don't need it. Snish, you didn't pour the Shirayim. Now, what about the Rabbi Yehuda? In other words, Rabbi Yehuda cannot use one of these two exclusionary words to tell you that Shirayim, let's go with the Seder, is not essential, because Shirayim, Rabbi Yehuda, is a lot more chashuv in his eyes than the way Rabbi Nechemia views Shirayim. For Rabbi Yehuda, Shirayim is like any other step. Now, it's taka not done bifnim, which means lefnai v'lefnim. So, if say that is only essential lefnai v'lefnim, kishitas Rabbi Yehuda, then Shirayim is not essential. If we won't limit the chukah only to lefnai v'lefnim, even if that which is done outside needs to be done ala seder, even with the Yeved, then Shirayim will be the same. Ima akvi ma'akvi, ilay ma'akvi ma'akvi. In other words, now we're coming into a very interesting concept. How chashuv is the whole concept of Shirayim? According to Rabbi Yehuda, it's like any other step of the avodah, and that's Kiddatanya. And it's amazing that we find this pasuk also in Achrei Mos. But we're going back a few psukim. We're going now. This is Vayikra Tezayin to pasuk Chaf. It says in the pasuk that Tefilla mechaper es hakodesh, that the Kohen Gadol, Tefilla means he concluded, he finished, to effect the atonement concerning the holy. So say Chazal that im kiper, then kolom. Only if the kapara was done. Now, the kapara means the avodas hadam, which is that which brings primarily the kapara. If you did all of the blood services, that's what kiper, then you can say you finished. You were yoitza. Im loy kiper, loy kala. But if you didn't do all of the steps of the atonement, meaning you didn't do all of the steps of avodas hadam, then you didn't finish the avodah. We'll apply that in a moment. These are the words of Rabbi Akiva. Amaloi Rabbi Yehuda to Rabbi Akiva. I don't understand. The Torah writes vechila mechaper. What word does God use first? Vechila. You could have said the same limud following the seder of the words of the Torah. Why are you saying that you need to do all of the kapara to be able to say I finished the avodah kiper kala? Say it in the seder of the pasuk. Mepnei maloi nemar im kila. If you finish doing whatever the Torah wrote, then keep it. Meaning, im loy kala, if you didn't finish everything that God wrote, then you didn't get the full atonement. In other words, she'im chisar achas min hamatonos, concludes Rabbi Yehuda, I taka am saying, my limud kiseder hapasik, that if you didn't kila, what does not kila means? You did not do any one of this of the matonos, lo yasav lo klum. Now, when you read this Chazal, it only sounds like, in the beginning, that they are arguing how to word this limud. Is there a practical nafkamina between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Akiva? Is it only, should we say, that im kiper kala, or im kala kiper, or is there actually, they're having a machlokes in a certain din? And the Gemara says there are two ways of understanding this machlokes. And they asked in the yeshiva, my benayu, and the Gemara clarified, Rabbi Yechanan and Rabbi Shua ben Levi, Chad Amar. Indeed, they are not arguing concerning a din. And this is, guys, remember this statement. It's called Ma'ashmois Dorshin Ika Benayu, which would mean that L'kula Alma, just to tell you, L'kula Alma, Shirayim is not Ma'akev. Shirayim is not called a matana. We'll speak it out more in a moment. Elama, when you share one of the teachings of Torah Shabbat Peh, so word it correctly. So Rabbi Yehuda was bothered that Rabbi Akiva was wording it in the opposite order of the pasuk. So he words it, he can say that pasuk. But they are both really saying that matanos, which is what brings kapara, because we all know that the kapara, by all, you get the kapara, even though you didn't pour the shirayim, by all karbanis. That means that what would happen if after you did avodah sadam by any carbon, the coin slipped and all of the dam fell on the ground? It doesn't matter. Everyone will agree that we are speaking about the proper applications of dam on the mizbeach. That is what's essential. It's just how to word the limud. However, one of these two, either Rabbi Yechanan or Rabbi Shua ben Levi, no, shirayim ma'akvi ike benayu. And let's read inside the Rashi. It's more or less a middle of the Amid. Rabbi Akiva, who was not following the sequence of the pasuk, dafki, he went out of order. He holds that shirayim is not ma'akev. That's exactly what he meant to say, because he uses the word kapara as the base. If kapara was done, then you finished. Kapara is not shirayim, which implies that if you did all of the matanos on the mizbeach proper, even though you didn't do shirayim, yes, kala. Let's read it. Im kiper, meaning iker hamatanis kala. Then you can walk away and say, I finished avodah, afilu l'shavach shirayim. But Rabbi Yehuda, who says no, by Yom Kippur, you have to finish. Even that which normally is not considered something that brings atonement, which is the point of the Shirayim, doesn't matter. God mentioned it. And you have, by Yom Kippur, you got to do every step. Im kola hakoil os keeper. Ve'im loy, right? Movement the Bach probably adds, im loy kola hakoil, ein hakapara, shel hamatana is kapara. So indeed, Rabbi Yehuda, Lishitasei, my friends, holds that Shirayim on Yom Kippur is like any other step of the Avodah. So therefore, he rejects Rab Nechemiah's, there's Zois and Achaz, and Rab Nechemiah is using one of them to exclude Shirayim. Can be. Shirayim, Rabbi Yehuda, Lishitasei, on Yom Kippur is essential for the Kapara. Here, you didn't finish the Shirayim, im loy kilo, then loy kippur. Beautiful. So
Rabbi, can you just explain practically how that would work according to Rabbi Yehuda? So they did the entire avodah, and then let's say the blood spilled out before they were able to do the shirayim. So now they have to shecht a new animal, go take it and dump it in the yisoid or wherever they pour the shirayim, and then
yes, they have to. Yes, they have to. Yes, you have to do that step. Correct.
And according to the other opinions, you wouldn't have to do that.
You don't have to do that. Correct. Gavaldik. Perfect. Yes. Okay. So now, hold on. Says the Gemara, Mi Amar Rabbi Yechanan Hachi. What are we going back to? Hold on. We're taking a step back now. Rashi, 10 lines before the bottom of that small Amud. Mi Amar Rabbi Yechanan Hachi, says Rashi. What Rabbi Yechanan? That what? That the Rebbe Nechemiah Bechlal Shenayim Loy Ma'akvi. Right? The Ka'amrin on La'el. Why is that Rabbi Yechanan? Because Rabbi Yechanan is the one that said that both Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nechemiah, Shnei Mikra Echad Darshu. And we came to the understanding that the pasuk doesn't only have one exclusionary word, Achas, but there's also the Zois. And he said, that's all a hemshech to Rabbi Yechanan. That what? The Rabbi Nechemiah Chad Lemu'ut Shirayim. The Loy Ma'akvei. This is Gavaldik. Now, do we have Rabbi Yechanan saying that? Actually, we don't have Rabbi Yechanan saying it directly, because what Rabbi Yechanan said was only Vishnei Mikra Echad Darshu from the word, the Chuka from the Achas, right? When the Gemara said here, the fourth line, Elohainu Tama de Rabbi Yehuda, not everyone will learn that Elohainu Tama is Rabbi Yechanan. I'm saying this just to say why it's not a Teyufta. But based on the understanding that Rabbi Yechanan will agree that they both learn it from the same pasuk, it's not just because the Torah limits the chukah to the achas, but the pasuk also has the zois, which would mean that Rabbi Yechanan has to explain that Rabbi Nechemiah holds that even on Yom Kippur, Shirayim is not ma'akav. We know from elsewhere otherwise. Now we have a problem. Rabbi Yechanan, this Rabbi Yechanan is a statement that we have in Zuvachim, that Tana, Rabbi Nechemiah, what are we talking about? This is what we're talking about. There is a din we learn in Zevachim called someone who is going to be offering a korban outside the Beis Hamikdash. And my friends, that's a sin for which you're chayiv kares. And here the question is, if someone would only pour shirayim on a mizbeach that someone built outside the Beis Hamikdash, are you chayiv kares or are you not chayiv kares? What is that contingent upon? Any step that must be done b'fnim, right, which is therefore called an avoida. If you did an avoida, bachutz, you're chayiv kares. It's very much linked. If you're going to hold that pouring the dam b'fnim of the shirayim is not essential, you cannot call this an avoida. And if someone were to do it bachutz, he shouldn't have done it. They're not going to be chayiv for the sin of maila bachutz. The problem is that in Zevachim, Rabbi Yechanan said that he is explaining the Mishnah over there that says that if someone poured shirayim only, bachutz, the chayiv kares, that follows Shitas Rab Nechemiah. That mamash contradicts what Rabbi Yechanan said over here. Now, guys, it's not a teyufta, because, again, the line number 4 in Amud Beis is not said by Rabbi Yechanan. That will be the way out. In other words, we are just presuming that since Rabbi Yechanan said, Vishnei Mikra Echad Darshu, and the only justification for Rabbi Yehuda to further limit the chukah is not enough from the achas, it must be from the zois. So Rabbi Nechemiah also has to deal with two words, achas and zois. So we came to the logical conclusion that is using one to exclude the shirayim. But that doesn't fit. That does not fit, because we clearly hear from Rabbi Yechanan, who holds that Rabbi Nechemiah holds that shirayim is considered a step in the avodah. Which would be why if you pour the shirayim achutz, you'll be chayiv kares. Okay, let's move on.
But we just need another explanation in the word zois according to Rabbi Nechemiah.
Yes, according to Rabbi Nechemiah,
because it is ma'akav.
That's right. So it's a kasha. We don't have that. We don't see what that would be, Danny. That's why we're saying kasha. Just explain why it's not a tiyuft. Okay. Omar Rabbi Chanina, guys, we're gonna apply the Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nechemia that out of sequence gavaldik by saying this statement. Omar Rabbi Chanina, guys, we just had this above. Ketoyre shechafana, if the Kohen Gadol did the chafina before he shechted the par. Our seder was vidui rishon, goydel, vidui sheni shchita, then the chafina. If he did step number 4 before step number 3. So the din is, lo yasav alei klum. Meaning, not only does he have to shech the pot, of course, but after he shechts the pot, you have to redo the chafina. So asks the Gemara, Keman, is this the loike Rabbi Yehuda? Why? Because if Rabbi Chanina would hold like Rabbi Yehuda, the Rabbi Yehuda, ha'ama, now Rabbi Yehuda says that kik siva chuka was only bedvarim hanasam a big lovim mi bafnim udechsiva, and the chafina is not done bafnim. So guys, that's what we learned at Rashi and Amud Aleph. So the Gemara says no, that even Rabbi Yehuda holds that there are 2 steps that are technically done b'chutz, they are halachically done b'fnim. Afilo temer Rabbi Yehuda tzoyrech pnim kepnim dami, and that includes side the shchita of the par and later of the soid, because the dam of the soid also has to be brought lefnai v'lefnim, and the chafina, the whole avoid of the ketoides is done b'fnim. Says the Gemara, I have a question on that. Tanan, we learned in our Mishnah. Our Mishnah gave a couple of examples of out of sequence. Im ad shaloi gomar matones shebefnim nishbach adam. So what's the Mishnah say? Yavi dam achar, and the Tanakama. We're focusing when we learned the Mishnah. We were just focusing on: do you continue where you left off from, Rab Lazav and Rab Shimon, or do you have to go back to the beginning of that set? So the Tanakama holds v'yachse v'yazem etchilim mibefnim. But you know what the Tana didn't mention? The Tana didn't mention about chafina. Notes, guys, if the dam that spilled, if we are speaking about, right, the dam spilled in the kodesh kachim, so then l'chayda you should have to do another chafina. You invalidated the chafina. Ve'imisa yachsa ve'yafnu me'boyelei gavaldik. Answers in Daf Samach Aleph. B'ketoides loikamayri. Like Rashi says, yes, you have to do another act of chafina. The Mishnah is just not focusing on it. Look inside the top Rashi. Umiu vadai tzarich lahaktir ketoides acheres. Wow. So guys, appreciate what we're saying over here. You went in sequence. You did everything good. You shechted the damapar. You did chafina. The Kohen Gadol goes into the Holy of Holies. He offers the ketoides. Guys, halt up. Then remember, he left the kaf and the machta on the floor in the Holy of Holies. He went out to get the dam from the person who was steering it. He goes back into the kodesh kachim. In the middle of him sprinkling the dam of the pot against towards the ark cover, the dam fell out of his hand and spilled. He already brought the ketoides. Since he has to do the avodah here in the kodesh kachim, so what are we saying? We're saying all of the avodas that are done in the kodesh kachim are considered one set. So when the Mishnah says he has to go back and really shecht another par, it also means shecht another par, do a chafina, bring the ketoides again. Wow. Go out and get the dam par and begin back from the beginning of that set. Now this is very important. This is only if the dam hapar spilled in the kodesh kachim. Once he brought the ketoides, the dam hapar, and the dam hasoid in the kodesh kachim, now he's up to even only the next step. He's sprinkling the dam hapar towards the paroiches, and now the dam hapar spills, or the dam hasoir spills. He's going to have to shecht again. But here he only continues to do the avoida in the heichal, and he doesn't have to go back in the Holy of Holies. Subsequently, he doesn't have to do the chafina again. I just want to make that clear. In other words, there are 3 areas that are viewed as standalone areas. The Holy of Holies, everything in there, the ketoides, damapar, damasoir, the al or lifnei ha poroiches, damapar, damasoir, and the 3rd set is whether you mixed it before, whether you mixed it afterwards, it's the application of the dam and the mizbeach hapnimi. Gewaldig. Let's go weiter. We have another few minutes. Says the Gemara, Amar Ulam, another application of this din, so'ir sheshachatu koidem matan damai shel par. If you shech the soil before you apply the dam of the par, because remember, the shchitas apar is step number 3. Step number 4, we said, is the ketaitis. Step number 5 is the application of the dam of the par. Only then do you shech the soid. If you shech the soid prior, lo yasav alei klum. It says in our Mishnah, higdim dam hasoid le dam apar. So all the Mishnah said is, yachsoid v'yazem dam hasoid, after you did the dam apar. Now the problem is, v'im isa, that lo yasav alei klum. So yachsoid v'yishchat mibayalei. You would have to slaughter it again. So tirgama ula, that this section of the Mishnah is speaking about the avoid of the heichel, if you can be medayik in the words of the Mishnah. And when it comes to that, the matana shebe heichel, it's like we just mentioned. There, you don't have to go back to the shechita. All you have, once you enter the heichel, if anything went out of sequence, you only have to begin the avoidus of the heichel again. When did Ula say that soir sheshachtu koydem matan tam shel par le'asav alei klum? That is if the soir was slaughtered before the dam apar was applied inside the kodesh kachim. Once you finish the avoid of the kodesh kachim, now we view all of the steps in the heichel as a standalone unit. And taka, they have to be done in sequence, but only for that which is done in the heichel. Now, I just want to make something else clear. If we're only speaking about the heichel, then this statement cannot be according to Rabbi Yehuda. Because according to the Tanach Rabbi Yehuda, we b'chlal don't care if the avoidus in the heichel are done out of sequence. So it must be that Ula is following Shitas Rabbi Nechemia. And indeed, let Rabbi Nechemia, anything that's done the big day lovin, other than the Shirayim, they say that is ma'akev. For that he says that if the Sar Sheshachtu Kodesh Matan Dam Shel Par Liyasav Alei Klum, that's in the Kodesh Kachim L'Kula Alma. And when the Gemara says that our Mishnah only speaks about redoing the Dam HaSoid after the Dam HaPar in the Eichel, that is only following Shitas Rab Nechemia, which would mean that Ula is telling us that our Mishnah follows the Shita of Rab Nechemia. Gavaldik, have it to be continued.
Rabbi.
Yeah.
In what we learned today, we were focused on this Reb Nechemia and Reb Yehuda. How do those opinions jive with the opinions that we learned in the Mishnah, vis-a-vis when you have to go back? There was we had two opinions in the Mishnah.
It's independent, Danny. In other words, forget about sequence. Let's go. Let Rabbi Yehuda, Danny, if I offered the Dam HaSo'ir, and then I offered the Dam HaPar, I'm good in the Heichel. But if in the middle of the Dam HaPar, all of the blood spilled out, then you have to shecht another par and bring the Dam HaPar. The only question will be, from what point? Do you have to bring the Dam HaPar from Hazon number 1 or from where you left off? Will I have to do the Dam HaSoid after that? If I did the Soid, that's a separate machlekes. According to Rabbi Yehuda, no, I won't. According to Rabbi Nechemia, yes, I will. So according to Rabbi Nechemia, according to the Tanach, not only do I have to begin with the pot again, then I'll have to do the soid.